the violins of autumn wound my heart with a monotonous languor.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Today at 1, we're live in Ukraine as Russia invades in a major military assault by land, sea and air.
It's now more than a month since the US Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. China's ambassador to Australia also issued a blunt warning a few days ago that those who push for Taiwanese independence will be punished.
We're waiting for a peaceful reunification, but we cannot rule out other options.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore.
Welcome to Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight. The show where we speak to those on the front lines of defending democracy around the world. New episodes drop every Friday, and if you enjoy this program, then I do have one favour to ask of you. If you can think of just one other person who you think may enjoy it as well, may find value in it, a friend, colleague or family member, then share it with them and tell them why you like it. With your help, we can help get these vital stories out to more and more people. Also, don't forget to check out the rest of my work on the Dictators v Democrats YouTube and Substack channels. If you want to support my work, then paid subscribers to Substack and Patreon get access to Why We Fight 1 week early. With all of that said, let's find out why they fight. Welcome to Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight. Today I'm very glad to be joined by Commander Lance McMillan, a gentleman who has spent 25 years plus in the US Navy, followed by a career in military wargaming, and now is often a host or co-host on In Time News, an independent news service based in the United States that talks about the key issues facing the United States and her democracy. Lance, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here.
So you've had a really interesting upbringing, moving between
Yes.
countries around the world during the middle of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And how did growing up inside these very different sort of political systems, albeit on military bases, shape your instincts about power, authority, and the role of the state?
Well, I think it gave me kind of a unique outlook that many of my contemporaries and my peers didn't have. In the Navy, many of the people, if they'd been outside the country, it had only been for brief vacations, et cetera. And here I lived overseas for extended periods in a wide array of different countries. Plus, while living over there, we traveled a lot, so we visit other places. And you got to see not just the governmental differences between different systems, but also the cultural differences. And to me, the most eye-opening was perhaps the wealth divide, if you will. Living in some of the countries I lived in, it was really an eye-opener to see how abjectly poor the bulk of the populations were and how they were treated. And then you come back to the US after, my dad's 2 or 3 year assignment in that country. And it was just, you'd walk into a store and there was all this stuff. And when you did that, for example, in India, when I lived in India, you'd go into a store and there'd be they'd have one version of a product, as opposed to in the US, there was 2 or 3 shelves of different versions of the same product. And it was just, I think the best way to put it is people have always asked me, well, did you experience culture shock? And I always tell them, yes, the one place I experienced culture shock was when I came back to the US, never going to any of the foreign countries, because I went without preconceptions, I think. And you sort of accepted what you saw. as opposed to you came back here and it was just like the stark night and day difference.
And your father worked for the CIA.
We prefer to say he worked for a 3-letter organization which I can neither confirm nor deny exists.
I understand he's unlikely to have been able to talk about work too much at home, although do correct me if I'm wrong.
No, he didn't talk about work terribly much. In fact, I remember on my 16th birthday, he took me aside for the very serious talk to tell me, just so you know what my job really is, I don't just work at the embassy and all this. And I'm going, yeah, Dad, I've known for a long time. The thing that made it obvious to me that he wasn't just a normal, embassy official was that we'd entertain lots of different foreign guests at our house, and you got kind of blasé about the fact that, oh yeah, here's the KGB resident who's coming to visit and come for dinner and cocktails, or the military attaché from the French embassy or what have you. And we just had a constant stream of different governmental and diplomatic people rolling through the house. And the thing that a lot of people don't get about the intelligence field, it may have changed since he was active in it. I'm sure it has quite a bit, but it's not James Bond. It's not that kind of stuff. As my dad liked to jokingly say, it's old men sitting around having a beer together, talking about things, sharing information, seeing if you can get more out of him than he's getting out of you.
And how did that knowledge of how that world works, because it's such an alien world to many people, most people never encounter it, how did that shape the decisions you made later in joining the service, etc.?
Well, it shaped my worldview. I don't think it necessarily influenced my decision to join the service. My decision to join the service was kind of odd, is the best way to put it. I had gotten out of university. I graduated. I got a management trainee job with a firm that did building maintenance. And after working at that for a year, I said, this is really not for me. So I was puttering around doing odd jobs to pay the rent and looking for work. And I saw an ad in the paper that said government management positions. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And I picked up the phone and called the number, and they answered it with Navy opportunities. And I was that far, I mean, a hair's breadth from hanging the phone up, but I didn't. And 25 years later, that was my career. So
that's so interesting. I speak to people like yourself, people like General Petraeus. So why did you join? Why did you take that oath? And General Petraeus was, well, I knew the guys from West Point because I grew up around them, and they seemed like the kind of guys I wanted to be. And it was very rarely that I saw it's about these big ideas. Quite a lot of the time, it's just, this seems like a really good opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people get into the military not necessarily out of some burning patriotic impulse, but just because it sounded like a good idea at the time. It was a career that was interesting. I think one of the big differences for me, though, is once I got in, I would say within maybe a year, I knew I wanted to have, a full year or a full 20-year plus career. A lot of the people I know that were around me didn't think in that terms, in terms of, wanting to be in for the full time. They kind of, well, I'll finish out my current contract, and then, well, I think I'll stay until the next level. Well, okay, it looks interesting. I'm having fun. I'll stay to the next level. And that was the kind of way they approached it. But I knew pretty early on that this was what I wanted to do.
Mm. And something I like to ask, especially former US military personnel, and something myself and General Hodges touched on, was the state of the oath at the moment.
Yeah. I served under both Republican and Democratic presidents. I came in when Reagan was president, so the giant buildup to the 600 ship Navy that they lauded so much at the time. I never had any doubts that the national leaders were kind of trying to look out for the best interests of the country, that their goals and beliefs, while maybe different than mine, were certainly in line with them, in parallel thinking, if you will. But we'll just say that recently, I'm definitely seeing leadership that I'm going, I really don't like where this is going. A lot of my father's old friends, my dad passed 3 years ago, and they will, when we get together and chat, they'll say, boy, I'm really glad your dad isn't around to see what has happened to his country. And yeah, I feel the same way in a lot of cases. It's shocking.
And we're going to get back to that. But something in your career that I find really interesting, after you retired from the Navy, you started going into conflict simulation and wargaming. And for the audience, can you explain what that is?
Well, I didn't start it when I retired. I'd been into that kind of gaming, historical simulations, that kind of thing, probably since junior high school. So I'd been playing games like that, and it had gotten me into military history, or military history had gotten me into the gaming. It was kind of a mixed blessing at the same time, if you will. I should clarify, I'm not talking about professional simulations. I did a number of those when I was on active duty. I was kind of the go-to point man for any command I was at that was tasked to, participate in this war game. Oh, Lance loves war games. We'll send him. Because most of the other officers was like, this is a complete waste of time. I don't want to do this. Throw me into that briar patch. So when I retired, I was kind of sitting around with friends, both online and in person. We'd play games, and somebody had talked about a particular game that had come out, published by some new startup company, and they thought it was really good. And they said, here, you should try this and see what you think. And I played it, and I corresponded with the guy who ran the company. I said, I really like your design, and this is interesting. Do you take outside submissions? He said, no, typically we just do this in-house. Okay, great. He said, but we're always looking for people to play test the games. So he sent me a copy of one that they were play testing, and I wrote 15 pages of notes of this is wrong, you need to fix this, this is. And after that, he said, okay, well, for this particular series of games, you are now the series developer.
Okay, that's a good way to fall into something.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I fell into it. And thereafter, I kind of ran that entire branch of the company that was doing that series of games. And I think in the end, before they sold the company, they published close to 40 games in that series. So my thumbprint had been on it. And then as I proved my ability to handle things and that I was doing a good job, they started using me to evaluate new products that other people would send in, say, here's a design that they want. What do you think? Is this worth developing into a publisher? Should we just tell them thank you, no thanks? And we did a lot of stuff like that. So,
and now you've gone into news media commentary with In Time News, which is kind of an unusual independent news service.
yeah.
Can you describe what it is and how it's sort of structured?
Well, independent news service stuff. I started working with Nick Suter, who does In Time broadcast. And I was introduced to him by a local friend who is a retired police officer, but we had met doing gaming together. And he knew Nick because Nick had interviewed him regarding law enforcement trends and such. And Nick had said, I really would like to talk to somebody who could advise me on, I don't even remember anymore what the crisis was, something in the Middle East, probably. Do you know anybody who could talk to me? So just, give me a briefing on what the situation in the Mideast is with regards to these changes. He said, oh yeah, Lance should be fine. So he put me in touch with him, and then Nick and I really hit it off. And so I became a regular on his show. And then he introduced me to a couple other places that I've been on regularly. And that's how it started and where I go. Different shows have different structures. Nick is fairly formal about how he does things. So we'll have a topic that we're going to talk about, and we take a week or so to research it, and then we discuss it online. One of the other shows is okay if I mention the name?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Another show that I'm on fairly regularly is called The Shills. They're very much a impromptu, seat of the pants kind of organization. They don't really start with doing any research. They just talk about whatever happened to catch their interest in the headlines that week. And I got called in with them because when Russia invaded Ukraine, they wanted to have somebody who could talk to military affairs. And Nick had said, oh yeah, Lance knows all about this kind of stuff. So he put me in touch with them. And I've been doing a weekly Ukraine update with them once a week since the start of the war. Actually, since before the start of the war. And then they started a new show, which is, doing news stories that people aren't usually familiar with, that are kind of off the wall, unusual things. So I started participating in that. And I figured, I can find plenty of conflicts around the world to tell them about that people have never heard of, because wonders of wonders, human beings don't get along with each other very much.
Yeah, they do like to fight. And how do you balance, like, the facts as you know them, as a man with a long career in the military, especially in logistics, with responsibilities to your audience to help that they understand, but not to oversimplify or sensationalize?
I find one of the biggest things, and I blame the video game industry for this, if you'll forgive me, but people get really into technical minutia. Tell me all the details about the F-35. How fast does it fly? How good is its stealth capabilities? How much ordnance does it carry? That kind of stuff. And to me, none of that's really pertinent to somebody who is not a professional in understanding what's going on with a conflict. All you need to know is the fact that the US has fifth generation aircraft, and they're talking about going to war with a country that only has third generation aircraft. Well, it means that the country with the third generation aircraft will have no aircraft left after about 2 days.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do you think the advantages of these independent media outlets like In Time, like Shills, over traditional institutional media?
Increasingly, and this is my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
increasingly, I think what I call mainstream media has a very heavy thumb on the scales by the owners. So the very wealthy people who own the big broadcasting organizations, the big news media organizations, they tailor the news and present it in, or have it presented in such a way as to convey a message that suits their personal political or economic objectives. And so I think all these new little grassroots media groups that springing up, I think that's a very good thing, because those people are not necessarily answerable to the high and mighty. They can talk about things in a much more realistic light. The trouble is you have to sort through different gradations, because there are certain people that are running, their own streaming media organization that is already very heavily tailored. A perfect example would be like Charlie Kirk, the guy who was recently assassinated. He had a very definite message he was pushing, an agenda. And so he tailored the news that he presented to his viewership accordingly. And I don't want to say that that's strictly a political right side problem. You have the same issues on the political left side. I think it's incumbent upon viewers and consumers of news media of any sort to get a broad and balanced spectrum of opinions and presentations about a certain topic. So yeah, feel free to listen to, say, BBC or NBC, CBS, whatever here in the US. That's fine. But then also go out and search for other smaller organizations that report that stuff and see how their reporting differs. And then use your own innate intelligence to sift through all that data to come up with what you believe to be the honest, realistic opinion of what actually happened. Does that make sense?
Do you think it's realistic for Joe Public to be able to do that?
I do. I actually do. Now, I may be coming from a slightly colored past to get there. If somebody says, yeah, India and Pakistan are going to war, I can go, well, I've been to both countries and I kind of know what's going on, and I know the histories and everything. So I have a little more information, but I think the information is out there. And even Joe Public, who has trouble finding India and Pakistan on a map, can still do a small basic level of research that will get him more informed, and he can kind of at least look at it and say, well, that sounds like that reporting is heavily favoring India. That one is heavily favoring Pakistan. This one's oddly not favoring either. It seems to be favoring China and why China is concerned about what's going on, that kind of stuff. And I think people can do that. It's more work than a lot of people are willing to do, but it can be done.
Do you think it's made much harder by the way a lot of social media sites algorithms work when they reinforce or attempt to reinforce your biases?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I'll use YouTube as an example. I know that because I look for certain types of news and history and reporting, what YouTube recommends to me, as opposed to what I will find in a search if I'm looking for it, can be two very different things. So I think, again, the lazy man approach, which is, oh yeah, what's going on in India? And you type in India and something pops up. Okay, this must be what's going on in India. That's YouTube telling you what you want to hear, or it thinks that you want to hear, or that, and this is where my great concern is, what YouTube thinks you should be told you want to hear. So rather than just typing in India, you need to put in other search parameters and look for those and find sources that you feel are reliable. So, for example, anytime I'm looking at stuff in the Middle East, I don't just go with information that I get from US, say CBS, NBC, ABC, AP, what have you. I'll also look for BBC. I'll also look for Agence Presse out of France, Deutsche Welt, Al Jazeera. And the latter, I think, is critical because it's important to get the local opinion on what's going on and see what's happening. And yeah, it takes work to stay informed. And maybe I have more time as a retiree than most people to be able to do that. But I still think even your average Joe who's got a job and only has a couple hours every night to sit around and goof off, if you want to stay informed, you can do it. You need to devote some effort to it.
Okay. Well, shall we give that a go?
Sure.
What I want to do, I want to zoom in on 3 areas of the world. And what I want to know, especially, we'll start with Ukraine. A country I've been to and a war that we've both talked about an enormous amount. What do you think is the theory of victory for Ukraine?
I'm assuming what you mean is, what does Ukraine consider to be a victory?
Yeah.
Okay. For Ukraine, I think it's the restoration of their borders, the return of all the people who've been kidnapped, deported, probably something in the way of restitution for all the damage done to the country, and concrete security guarantees to ensure that this doesn't happen again. That's a big ask, all of that at once. And I know this, if it's heard by people that see me normally, I've mentioned this before. I think those are all the desirable points that Ukraine wants. But this gets back to my military background, my professional education and everything. One thing you understand about war termination theory is that both sides must make compromises unless you're going for a complete knockout victory. So I think realistically, a knockout victory for Ukraine isn't in the cards. They're not a big enough country to take on a huge country and conquer Russia, so to speak. So to come up with an end game solution, it needs to be a negotiated settlement of some sort. And thus far, I have not seen any of the Ukrainians who speak, spokesmen, people who speak on behalf of Ukraine, not even officially. Nobody wants to see a compromise. There's nothing like saying, okay, well, we'll give up Donetsk and Luhansk, but we get to keep all the other provinces and we get Crimea back or something like that. And I'm not saying that's what needs to be done. I'm just saying, for instance, Ukraine or Ukrainian people, when they talk about the end game, aren't at the point where compromise is part of the discussion yet.
I'm not sure I entirely agree. I think there is an acceptance that amongst some of the people I speak to, not all, of course, that the regain of the temporarily occupied areas may be a generational goal. But when it comes to compromise around land, I think that there is a recognition that the land that is being demanded is so heavily fortified that the historical parallel would be Czechoslovakia losing the Sudetenland.
Oh, yeah.
So it ties in with the security guarantees. They lose the land, then they lose a very, very important pillar in the security guarantees, because this is land Russia's never been able to take.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that account. I'm just saying that the one thing that war termination theory speaks to in great detail is the fact that both sides need to be willing to make compromises. And you typically don't get that until war weariness is set in on both sides. And we're not seeing that on either side yet. Yeah, the people are getting tired, but the leadership in both cases aren't really. I think Zelensky is getting to the point where he realizes that that may need to be the case. And I agree with you. They're making initial overture sounds like they're willing to discuss certain matters, but we're not seeing that coming out of the Kremlin. The Kremlin's declaration, regardless of however they put it, is Ukraine simply ceases to exist.
Yeah, absolutely maximalist. Their war goals haven't changed since day one.
No, and they aren't going to, because that stated goal and Putin's life are inseparable.
Yeah, they are. It's existential for Putin. Yeah.
Yeah, because if he says, okay, well, we're not going to go and do what I said, yeah, the oligarchy will rise up and he'll fall out of a window or something. So he knows he has to keep pushing the war until the very end. There's no way out.
And I want to pivot all the way across the Atlantic.
Sure.
And ask about the current state of matters in the United States from an American. Most of my audience is British. So how deep is the decline in democratic norms and institutions? Because looking at it from across the pond, it looks very worrying indeed.
It is very worrying. It's, in some cases, one might say terrifying if you're a student of history, because you look at what's happening now and the parallels that were occurring in Weimar Germany in the 30s, early 30s. And it's hard to see that there's any significant difference. You know, the names are changed and the underwear is a different color, but it's the same damn kind of nonsense. And I think that's really what the MAGA movement, and to be sure, I think the MAGA movement's more of a front than the actual power behind the throne driving the train group. But their demands are basically that we're going to turn this into some sort of autocratic government. I wouldn't say fascism, because I think they will still keep the trimmings of a democracy, kind of like what you see in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries where, oh yeah, we're a democracy, but admittedly, the same party has been in power since we first achieved independence, because we're democratic elections where I won 117% of the vote that voted in the last election. And I can easily see that kind of thing happening here. I think the Trump administration is pushing vigorously in that direction for two reasons. One, because they all want to end up as kind of the new techno-feudal overlords of the country once the system is changed. And two, I think they realize that many of the ones who are the higher ups in the organization, they realize that if a democratic government that's got something resembling a set of cojones comes to power, most of them are going to be going to jail because they've broken so damn many laws. And it's kind of the same thing with Putin and why he can't change his demands in Ukraine. These guys can't step back because they know that's what is in their future if they aren't on top of the dog pile.
And you mentioned the power behind the throne.
Yeah.
Could you articulate on that?
Heritage Foundation is one. Lots of what I would call quasi-oligarchy in this country, the billionaire class who already enjoy ridiculous amount of perquisites. You know, the case in point is I live up in the Pacific Northwest near Seattle, which was the hub of, Amazon. And I'm blanking on the name, but the guys who do the programming for our computer, Microsoft, that's it. Proportionally speaking, I'm fairly comfortably well off, but not just but other people who live in the area where I am, who are living in single wide trailers, pay a higher proportion of our income in taxes than Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates.
Yeah.
They may pay more in raw money, but when you look at the proportion of their income that's being taxed, that they're losing, yeah, why does some guy in a single wide end up paying 35% of his income and Bill Gates is maybe 5%?
You know, I know it's a lot more money, but proportionally it's
right.
Yeah,
exactly. And corporations that literally pay no taxes at all because they've made, it's mind-boggling, but they've made deals with local and state governments that say, well, if you don't lower my taxes, then I'm going to relocate my business from your town, your state, to somewhere else that will give me no taxes. And so that's what happened. So a company like Boeing, which made a deal with the government of the state of Washington that they would keep their corporate headquarters and the majority of their workings here if they didn't have to pay taxes. And he said, okay, we'll do that. And as soon as they did that, then they opened new branches. It wasn't relocating the old branches. It's new stuff in South Carolina. Why? Because South Carolina has a law called right to work, which means you can't be unionized.
Okay.
And that was one of the problems because here in Washington, they had fairly strong pro-union laws. South Carolina, just the opposite. So the idea is, well, we're not relocating. We're just gradually shutting down all the functions here in Washington, keeping our corporate banner in some, office in a building somewhere where we have a secretary who answers phones and punches us through to the real corporate offices in South Carolina. But for tax purposes, we're not getting taxed because we're located in Washington, all three of us.
It seems so self-defeating. I recall an anecdote from when I lived on Long Island of the Hamptons. For those who aren't aware, you live in the Hamptons if you're too rich to live in New York City. And they banned multi-occupancy homes, so you couldn't have a roommate, that sort of thing. And so many people had to leave, but these were the people that provided all the services. So you had a lot of very wealthy people trying to work out in their $1,000 trainers how to turn on their lawnmower.
Yep.
And it seems so self-defeating, and it damages positive freedoms.
We don't want
I
to
always
live
recommend
around
people
those people.
Yeah, exactly. And it damages positive freedoms.
San Francisco is another case in point similar to what you're talking about, which very liberal city, but the cost of living, particularly the cost of rent, had gotten so high that teachers who were teaching in San Francisco had to relocate across San Francisco Bay or way down the peninsula to other communities that were at least semi-affordable. And eventually, the city of San Francisco basically built apartment buildings where if you are a teacher in this school district, we provide you an apartment because there's no way you can live within a commuting distance otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, that's bonkers that they have to do that. It's good that they did it. Yeah. Yeah, well, because you lose your job, then you're going to lose your flat pretty immediately.
Yeah.
What can those of us in the other democracies do to help? Because looking, when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world tends to catch a cold.
Yes.
And a lot of people over here feel sort of helpless.
Americans, many of them, will tell you that they are Christians. The reality is the true God in America is your bank account. And if you don't like what America is doing, hit it economically, and things will start changing. And we're already seeing those kind of pressures occurring because, for example, once the orange imbecile started doing his, Europe is the natural enemy, so to speak, people canceled all those contracts they had for U.S. military equipment. And they started buying European. And suddenly there's a lot of pressure popping up in this country from defense industrial complex against the Republicans and the MAGA movement because those corporations are losing massive amounts of business because of this. And I think it's a great idea that Europe is kind of banding together and making its own defense industry and buying internally because it's putting the US on notice. Hey, we can be your friends and buy your toys, but we can also buy our own damn toys if you're not going to be friendly.
Yeah. I mean, Europe has a top tier defense industry across, Thales, BAE Kinetic, etc., Rheinmetall. But it's always been for relatively small European armed forces or for export. So the knowledge is there. Where Europe is catching up is the volume.
Yeah, because let's say that I can't remember the exact numbers, but if memory serves, the last major armor purchase that the UK did was like 270 tanks or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's a tiny number.
Yeah.
But if you're not just selling to the UK and maybe, say the Saudis or somebody, but if you're also selling to Spain and Portugal and Italy and Greece and all the other countries in Europe, that number goes up quite a bit. Everybody gets a cost benefit from the whole, buying in quantity kind of thing. So yeah, it makes sense that Europe is going to have to start looking to itself rather than competing with itself, because when you have BAE competing against, Saab and other countries for making an aircraft, everybody's losing business. If you start doing consortium work, then you're much more effective in countering, big Uncle Sam across the water.
And talking about the US-Europe relationship, from, we can't talk about it at the moment without talking about the new national security strategy.
Oh God, that document took 70 plus years of American strategic thinking about cooperative defense, threw it in the toilet, took out a turd, bronzed it, stuck it on a pedestal, and said, "Oh, Trump is so great. Look at this brilliant plan he's come up with."
I mean, I'll give you a quote from it. Like the larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech, and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates, and sorry, the grammar is terrible actually, and loss of national identities and self-confidence.
You do realize that this document, if the initial draft wasn't out of the Kremlin, then the Kremlin at least got final approval authority before it was published.
Well, the Kremlin very much liked it. I don't know if they got final approval
I'm
authority.
convinced that they were involved in the creation of said document.
How?
I think the ties between the administration and the Kremlin are a lot deeper than people imagine. I think the president owes his current position and his wealth in large part to intervention by various Russian oligarchs and the Russian mob. And I think many of the people he surrounded himself with are doing the same kind of thing. I think they're all deeply compromised.
Interesting. I asked Anthony Scaramucci the same question: why is Trump so weak on Putin? And he gave me an anecdote. It was a very brief conversation, but he basically echoed that. He thinks the Kremlin have something on him. And he gave me an anecdote of...
A lot of people have, speculated about, the P tape or all that garbage.
Yeah.
I don't think it's anything
it
like that. I think it's much more basic. I think Trump was in economic trouble, and he had been courted by the Russians for quite a while. And when they found out about this, they said, well, heck, we can get you a loan from Deutsche Bank. And you won't even have to secure it. We'll secure it for you. We'll underwrite your loan. So he knows if he pisses them off, they just say, we're canceling our underwriting of your loan. The bank recalls all the money. And he goes from being, the world's greatest billionaire to a man panhandling on the street.
Well, I mean, certainly undermine him with the greater part of the US population, certainly not the extreme elements of his MAGA movement. But talking about the NSS again, undermining 70 years, where do we go from that? Say 2028, we get a Democrat with some stones in. How does the United States rebuild these relationships?
There's an old joke phrase that we used to use in the Navy, and I'm sure it's everywhere outside the Navy as well, but forgive the crude language, but one aw shit ruins 10,000 attaboys. And that's where we're at. This one document alone destroys all of the credibility, all of the goodwill, all of the trust that we built up in that 70 plus years. And now we're back at ground zero and we have to re-earn all that. We can't just have a Democrat pop into office in 2028 and say, okay, everything's back to normal, because all that trust is gone. Everybody in Europe is looking at America as an alliance partner saying, yeah, but all we need is you to elect another bozo like this, and we can't trust that you're going to stand up to your promises. So we have to go the distance. We have to go the extra mile to rebuild that, and it's going to take generations to do that.
And before I ask about the final country in my triptych of Spark Notes, what are your midterm predictions?
I think if it is a fair and open election, I think that the Democrats stand a reasonably good chance of regaining both chambers. But you'll notice that I qualified that statement.
Yes.
I am not optimistic that it is going to be an open and fair election. I think the powers that be behind the MAGA movement are going to go an extra distance to ensure that the Republicans remain in control so they can, put the big red Christmas bow and tie the knot at the end of the 4 years and say, yeah, we've done everything we set out to do. So I think there will be, we're already seeing them trying to do it with all the gerrymandering that's been going on. You know what I'm talking about, I assume your readers do. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think we're going to have voter suppression going on. I think we're going to have possibly even falsified returns in red states where governors have a lot more control over what's going on. I think, that they're secretaries of state, because at the state level, that's one of the jobs of the Secretary of State is to oversee the elections. If you've got a very strong MAGA governor and a very strong MAGA Secretary of State, it's not hard for them to, the number of votes that were in favor of the Republican candidate were so much larger than predicted by the polls. It's very surprising, but we have proof right here.
It beggars belief. I find it difficult to. Gerrymandering, yes, that's a tradition as old as time, at least in the democracies and representative ones. But actual ballot stuffing, I find, perhaps it's naivety, but I almost don't believe it.
The 2024 election, we had some of that. We had cases where districts that were known to be fairly strongly blue, ballot boxes disappeared, never got delivered, never got counted.
Where can I find a source on that?
Arizona, I know, was one of them. I think Florida had some issues as well. Famously, Trump called somebody, one of the governors, saying, I need you to find me X number more votes.
Well, that was in 2020 in regards to Georgia.
Yeah, but there was similar stuff going on in 24. The other thing is voter suppression is a lot more subtle. So, for example, in known neighborhoods where you have largely reliable Republican voting blocks, they will have multiple polling stations where you can go and vote. So there's no line, not difficult for you to get to a place to do it. In other neighborhoods which are more blue, particularly ones which are in minority neighborhoods, there'll be one polling station. The lines will go round the block. And if you get out of line, you can't come back into the line. You have to go to the end of the line again. So if you need to take a potty break, or if you need to get something to drink, or if you're just an old person whose back is aching and need to sit down, you're out of luck. In the red districts, the Republican districts, the polls close at 8 o'clock, but you were still in line, so we're going to take you. In the blue districts for the Democrats, well, I'm sorry, the poll closed at 8 o'clock. I don't care if you're in line, go home. You don't get to vote. That kind of stuff. And there's lots of recorded instances of that.
My last in the triptych, Venezuela. Sure. Are we going to see a special military operation?
I think they want to, but they're also worried about the fallout of if they do. it's all very neat and antiseptic and clean if all you're doing is blowing up a few boats in the water and talking about, oh, yes, we're keeping America safe from drug smugglers. Having worked in the counter narcotics world as my last assignment in the military before I retired, I can talk to some detail about that. And honestly, many of the boats that they're hitting, I think, are definitely not involved in what they're saying. The fact that they kill all the survivors, we don't want witnesses being able to being interviewed, that kind of stuff.
Well, that's a crime, is it not?
Huh?
Is that not a crime?
Of course it is. But the president can pardon you for any sort of crime.
Of course.
Forgetting that little tidbit?
Yeah, the presidential pardons always seemed completely bizarre to me.
It's worse than bizarre. And particularly in its current form, where it's even gotten to the point of pay to play. In other words, if you give me $1 million, I will give you a pardon. That kind of thing. That's definitely not what that program was intended for. I mean, I agree with and support the concept of having a presidential pardon where you can look at certain things and say, yeah, you were unjustly treated. We're going to take care of it. You've served your time, etc. But the way it's being done now goes beyond the pale. Pure and simple. But I see a lot of what's going on right now. They'd love to go in, but I don't think they will because they know they'll get enormous pushback with the American public. But if they can frame it the right way, and I'm going out on a limb here, but I worry that there's going to be a false flag attack. I think something will come out that, the narco terrorists or even the Venezuelan government attacks a U.S. Navy ship or whatever, and suddenly, oh yeah, we've got to go in and protect ourselves.
Okay, that if we take that as a hypothetical, what's the objective? What's the aim? What's the war goal in doing this?
Number one, it's a distraction. It's hard to explain to people who are not American how the Epstein situation is so dangerous for Trump.
I think it's easier for Brits because we had Prince Andrew and it nearly caused the fall of the royal family.
But even so,
could have.
That's not the same level. The big issue is, as I said, a large number of Americans are declared Christians. And they can write off all his extramarital affairs, his paying Stormy Daniels hush money for all that stuff, alleged sexual assaults, alleged illegitimate children.
I mean, that's a long list of write-offs.
Most American Christians can kind of do this number and pretend that it didn't happen, or it's not as bad, or rich men just do that naturally. But the moment it crosses the line into pedophilia, they can't hide that, and they will take umbrage. They will get enraged if it's proven that he was, raping underage girls, basically. So using Venezuela as a wag the dog, because anytime America gets involved in a conflict, suddenly everybody rallies behind the administration. We've got to protect our boys. And the administration is always right because they wouldn't send them into harm's way for trivial reasons. That's the mental illness that pervades. So I can see as they get more and more desperate to hide the truth of what is in the Epstein files, they might look at Venezuela as a way. That's one side of the issue. That's the administration's side. The other side of the issue is the oil speculation. We have a number of very powerful, very outspoken, and I won't even say they aren't full-blown oligarchs, the Koch brothers, although there's only one left.
There's only one left, yeah.
Yeah, but I think their goal is to try to secure all sources of petroleum in North America under that one big thumb or coterie of, other oligarchs in the petroleum industry, and use that to make themselves even more powerful than they already are. And I think that's one of the reasons that Venezuela is so attractive, is because it does have such an enormous oil reserve. And you don't necessarily need to occupy it with American troops. You simply need to install a government which is pliable, as we've done with so many Central American countries, to American corporate interests.
And do you think that, and to what extent, if so, Americans became complacent?
I think we've been complacent through much of our history. We've had the ability to sit safely behind these two giant oceans with a small nation to the north who culturally, to most Americans, is indistinguishable from us, and a country to the south which has always had its own internal problems that couldn't find a way to really threaten us. So we just kind of looked at the world as, it's whatever we want. We are the ultimate expression, kind of like England was back in the day, of a maritime power. And a maritime power is not necessarily interested in occupying terrain. It merely wants to have access to markets to make money. And that's the way we did it. And so the American public kind of looked at the world as, well, we're safely ensconced in Fortress North America here. We don't need to worry about all that stuff. And even at the height of the Cold War, we had to go through a lot of internal gyrations with propaganda to convince the American people that Russia was indeed this huge ogre that was threatening us, to justify the enormous outlays of capital for our defense, which arguably wasn't really necessary if you want to look at it from that maritime power as opposed to continental power paradigm. You understand what I'm going here?
Yeah. I watch an enormous amount of US Naval War College lectures because I find them very interesting. Professor Sally Payne is hopefully going to be on this show.
I love watching
in good time. Yeah, she's fantastic. I've been in comms with her. And it's very interesting that the United States, or at least the Trump administration, is acting more like a continental power than a maritime power.
Yeah, he's definitely shifted the mental thinking process. And I think it would not surprise me that there is some perhaps unspoken, perhaps even unarticulated worldview between the Kremlin, the Forbidden Palace, and the White House, that we each get our spheres.
Monroe Doctrine. Yeah. Everybody
and
has their own slice.
And it's going back and looking at the world as Orwell saw it in 1984. There were the three grand superpowers who were constantly at war with each other, but they're not really at war with each other. They're just making wars to keep the population pliable. And I think to some extent that's what's happened. what real reason did we need to get involved in Vietnam or Korea?
Well, there was a theory behind both of those.
Well, I know. I did. Trust me, I know.
And it was a reason. It was a reasonable It was a reasonable, like, rules-based order theory.
Right.
Although Vietnam's a bit more questionable, but Korea certainly.
Yeah, and the thing I'm trying to point out, though, is that if you subscribe to the continental slant maritime, power theory, the U.S. really shouldn't have had a terrible lot of interest in those areas, and yet we went in with such enormous effort, and particularly in the case of Vietnam, without a lot of justification. We as you know, lied to our own population about the thing for the longest time. The Pentagon Papers, which honestly, even in today's world, you talk to most Americans, they have no idea what you're referring to. And I'm sure you and your viewers do, but I'll reiterate just in case. The Pentagon did a study, and it said, we cannot win in Vietnam. And they did this relatively early in the conflict. And yet we stayed there for as long as we did because politically it was unacceptable for a president to have to admit that, yeah, we're not going to win and we're just killing your sons for no reason other than to make us look good. And I think if you extrapolate out where that went with what's going on with Putin trying to resurge the Russian Empire and Xi doing his, China is going to Belt and Road everything on the planet if they can figure a way to do it. Maybe Orwell wasn't that far off.
And you're certainly doing your part in this struggle for at least to preserve democracy, free values, human rights. But when I say those words to you, what do they actually mean?
My father and I had a number of arguments as the years went on, and information became more and more available about some of the dirty things that his agency had been involved with. And I think up to close to his end, he was still convinced that the agency had been very good and honorable, and all of these claims of these illegal, unethical things that were done were not really true. They were being pushed by enemies of the United States and enemies of the agency and so forth. And I think there's a lot of that goes on that we in the public really are not aware of. That things are done by powerful people. And let's be honest here, when you say that, you really mean powerful men. And in the case of the United States, you're meaning powerful white men that we don't acknowledge, we don't like to talk about. And it's all about preserving the wealth, the power, the privileges, and everything for those who already have everything. And I think Europe at some point post-World War II started to realize that you could push that back and you could actually make things a little more freer, a little better for the average person by making changes to a system where you could still have these powerful people, but their ability to shape the country to their own desires was somewhat constrained. In this country, I think we went down kind of the opposite road. And it became synonymous with what is patriotic in America is also what is good for the powerful. And if it wasn't necessarily good for the rest of us, oh well.
And what advice would you have for somebody who doesn't know what to do, who feels stuck or worried about this, an American?
Yeah, Oh, I agree. I think the key thing is to get involved. Too much in this country, we focus on just the national election every 4 years, president. And since my retirement, I have found increasingly how much is actually influenced by local elections, county elections, state elections at the lower levels. And I think if people were more involved with and more aware of what those lower level political issues were and voted accordingly, ignoring the huge amount of influence that's being peddled by the powerful in form of political contributions to people that are going to see their interests. I think we could make a lot of changes in this country. Start at the grassroots, ground level, and work up, rather than everybody in this country tends to think work at the top level and it will change downwards. No, it doesn't. And in fact, arguably, the reason you've seen this resurgence in conservative, what has evolved into MAGA values, is because pre-Reagan, the Republican Party decided that was the way to do it, was to focus on the lower level stuff first. When everybody on the school board is in consonance with your ideas, then you can start educating kids to think in your terms. Ban those books that, promote free thinking, that promote different ideas. And then get on the Council for Urban Development and, okay, well, we're not going to allow these neighborhoods to have multiple family buildings. Everything in this neighborhood is only for the people who have enough money to own their own standalone home. You see what I'm getting at when you refer to that with the Hamptons and such. It all ties in. And I think if Americans got more involved with local politics, and yeah, it's boring to go to the town council meeting or the fire district meeting, but start getting involved, start doing that, and start corresponding with the people in DC, not the president, but your elected officials, and tell them, I'm not going to vote for you when it comes up for re-election because you're not favoring issues that are meaningful to me. And that's one of the ways the weekly Ukraine update that I do on the Shill Show, I always end that with the same admonition to the crowd. They say, everybody have closing remarks, and I say, make sure you correspond with your elected officials. Let them know that Ukraine is important to you, even if they're somebody that's not your party. If you and enough other people like you correspond with them and say, Ukraine is important to me, I want to see aid continue to Ukraine, then that will start to happen.
Do you have a message for the opposing team? Do you have a message for the dictators of the world and those who want to be them?
Historically, the pattern would suggest you're doomed. You're going to lose. Because over the broad course of time, things have constantly gotten better for the downtrodden, the oppressed, the poor. And we saw this, Europe, I would argue, did it first because you had the emergence of middle class. And that started changing the equation of who got to actually dictate what a country could do and what it couldn't do. We're seeing that starting to happen in other countries outside of Europe. And that's one of the things that I think suggests that the Trump administration, at least for us here, but also for other similar countries like that around the world, I think they're in the long run doomed. I think the historical record shows authoritarianism is going to erode, not completely change overnight. You're not going to go from Nazi Germany to liberal democracy overnight. It comes with a cost. It is a struggle, and it requires people to get involved. But in the long run, it's what wins. So they should be worried. And arguably, they should start making changes so they can preserve themselves. Depleted slightly, but still, you get my drift.
Vance, thank you very much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
My final question, and perhaps the most important I'm going to ask all evening. There is a slug on the cabinet behind you. What's its name?
The slug?
The slug.
It is a banana slug. Now, there are two things. Number one, this particular creature is endemic all up and down the west coast of the United States. It's called a banana slug because it's kind of greenish yellow in color. It's big, it's slimy, etc. People jokingly say, at least for those of us in the western half of Washington state, it's our national bird or state bird or whatever, because they're so common. The reason I have it there is because the mascot for the school I went to, the University of California, Santa Cruz, that's the mascot, the banana slug.
And does that particular banana slug have a name?
No.
Just the banana slug.
I'm sure the one down in, Santa Cruz does. I don't know what it is. All I know is when I was there, the school administration tried to change it from the banana slug, which didn't sound particularly, powerful and etc. They wanted to make it the sea lions. And so we held big protests and occupied the administration building and everything else because we wanted to keep our banana slug. And today, it's still the mascot for UC Santa Cruz.
Well, that is democracy manifest. Maintain the banana slugs.
Where do you think I got some of these crazy ideas?
Vance, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Fun to being here. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight. What struck you most about their story? What surprised you? What did you disagree with? Feel free to let us know in the comments below and we can have a conversation. But if you enjoyed this work, if you made it to the end, then, well, I hope that you did. Please do like, share and subscribe. With your help, we can grow this channel and we can get these voices out to more and more people. If you want to support my kind of work financially, then paid subscribers to Patreon or Substack get these episodes 1 week early. Again, that's on all podcast networks and on this YouTube channel. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and always remember, democracy is non-negotiable. Goodbye.